With the variety of applications offered by AWS, it can often be confusing to choose one to deploy your application. EC2 is the lowest level of do-it-yourself compute service that AWS Cloud provides. This might be attractive to some teams or developers, while others might just want their apps to be deployed without needing too much control over the underlying infrastructure. Now, AWS Beanstalk was introduced to solve this problem. If you're not ready to go containers or serverless, but want to quickly deploy and run your applications on AWS Cloud, then Beanstalk is your friend. In this video, let's learn how to get started using AWS Elastic Beanstalk by deploying a .NET Web API application onto it. We will first deploy using AWS Toolkit and directly from Visual Studio. We will also see how to set this up inside the AWS Console. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in my .NET on AWS series. Thanks to AWS for sponsoring this video. My name is Rahul and I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. Here in Visual Studio, I have a default ASP.NET Web API application. The only thing additional I have done for this particular application is enabled health checks for this application. So this adds a /health endpoint which exposes the health of this application. Now, if you're completely new to health checks, I highly recommend checking out my video linked here, which will be linked here and also in the descriptions below. Now, to deploy this application to AWS Elastic Beanstalk, I will be using AWS Toolkit. AWS Toolkit is a freely available extension that you can add to most of the IDEs that you can use to develop .NET applications. Now, I have already installed this toolkit on my Visual Studio instance, but I'll link a video here which will allow you to do the same if you haven't already installed. Now, once you have installed and set up the extension, you can navigate to your project and right-click on it to show the Publish to AWS option. Now, in here we have two legacy options which needs to be ignored. So you should be using the Publish to AWS option. So let's select that. And this gives you a few options to publish to. So in this case, we will be choosing the ASP.NET Core app to AWS Elastic Beanstalk on Linux. Now you also have the option to deploy this to Windows if you prefer that. Now, once you select that, you can edit the settings of this specific target deployment. So let's click Edit Settings to understand this a bit more. Now we have the name of the application. We also have an environment that this application is getting deployed to. So usually when you're building applications, you would first deploy them into a development environment and then promote them into a production environment. So this is the similar concept and this is the first environment that we would deploy to. So let's keep the name as dev. Now in this case, we can choose between the environment type. So you have single instance or load balanced. With single instance, there will be only one instance of your application, and with load balance, there would be multiple instances with a load balancer sitting in the front. For the dev instance, let's first deploy a single instance. We will see a load balanced scenario later in this video. Now you can set up a hosting proxy which has two options. One is to keep Nginx or leave it as none, which means it will use the Kestrel as the web service. Now one thing to note is that by default Beanstalk forwards the traffic to the port 5000. Now once you set up Nginx, it will be automatically wired up for that. However, if you choose Kestrel, you will have to make sure that your application starts up on port 5000, or you will have to modify the port that it forwards to. Now to start the application in 5000, you can set up the ASP.NET URLs as an environment variable or even specify that inside the app settings.json. If you want to learn different ways of starting up an ASP.NET application, let me know in the comments below and I'll make a separate video. For now, let's choose Nginx and keep moving. Now we have the platform that we can choose to. Now in this case, this is a .NET 8 application. So let's choose .NET 8 and the latest image of that. This also specifies the managed platform updates time and what time the platform would be updated. Now with Beanstalk, our applications are going to be deployed onto underlying EC2 containers, which will be needing patching and updating periodically. So this is specifying the preferred time for these platform upgrades. You can also specify some health and monitoring options and also the IAM roles that's required. Now in this case, it will be automatically creating a new role and setting it up inside when we deploy this to AWS. Now we can also specify VPCs, But however, let's leave that as default because we will be having this publicly accessible. Now, if you need to set environment variables or other configurations, you can do that here as well. Now, you can mark this as a self-contained build, which means the .NET runtime and libraries will be packaged along with the application bundle. So let's check that and click Publish. Now, this gives you a prompt warning saying that this is going to create resources inside your AWS account. Now, this might incur charges depending on how you have set up your AWS account. Now, if you don't have an AWS account, I highly recommend checking out the AWS free tier to set up a free account where you will get enough credits to run these applications. So let's click Yes to trigger off the deployment. Now, this has started the deployment. So this is going to package this application and publish this into AWS. Now, this is going to create different resources that's required for Beanstalk. If we switch over to our AWS console and navigate into the cloud formation option here, we should be able to see the create in progress for the Hello Beanstalk stack. Now, if we navigate further into this, we can see the events that's happening as part of the create and also the resources that's getting created. So you can see here there is a CDK metadata which is getting uploaded and that's getting used to set up our Beanstalk application. Now here this is creating an application, the environment, setting up the IAM roles, etc. We'll have to wait for some time until these resources are provisioned and ready to be used. So if we switch back to Visual Studio, it is now constantly polling that cloud formation stack for its status and logging the progress in here. Once this is done, we should be able to proceed to the next step. The deployment is complete and we have a green check here against that, which means it is also successful. We also have the URL for that specific environment and application that we just deployed. So if we navigate to this URL, it's first going to return an error because we don't have anything listening on this endpoint. However, if we navigate further into the weather forecast endpoint, which is where the API is exposed, we will be getting back the result from this API endpoint. So we have successfully deployed our ASP.NET Core Web API application onto Beanstalk. Now we can also navigate to the health endpoint, which should return healthy because this application is up and running. Before we navigate the console, let's understand a few of the Elastic Beanstalk concepts. It starts with an application. An Elastic Beanstalk application is a logical collection of Beanstalk components. So this includes environments, versions, and environment configurations. This is similarly for a logical grouping so that you can club different environments that your applications are running under one name. Now the application version is the specific version of the application that is running on your environment. Consider this as different releases or same to different builds that you would run to create a package for your application. Now, in this case, we deployed the code, which is the first version of that application code. Now, an environment is a collection of AWS resources running an application version. So each environment can run only one application version at a time. However, different environments can have different versions. Now, when you're building your applications, you would first deploy your application to the dev environment and then promote it to the production environment. So when you're making new changes to your application, this will create a new version, which will first go into the development environment. At that time, production will be running a different version. As you promote it to the further environments, they will all have the same application versions. You can read about the other concepts inside this documentation link, which I'll put in the descriptions below. Now, if I come back to our Elastic Beanstalk console, you can see here we have the applications. We also have the environments listed under the applications. So if I navigate further into the application, you can see the environment that this application has. So you can further navigate into the environment to see the actual details. So in here, you can find the domain URL that we just navigated to. You can also find the application that this is part of, the details of the servers that this is running. So we are running .NET 8 on Amazon Linux, and you can also see other information that's happening on this environment. So you can see all the deployment information in the events tab. So if I navigate into the health tab, you can find the health information. Now, since we haven't wired up the health endpoint for this is currently not showing anything. Now, if you want to modify the configurations for this environment, you can go to the configuration option on the left and select that. So you can see the different options that's available for configuring. So if you want to edit this, you can click the edit and change the settings. Now, if you want to add a database for this particular instance, you can do that as well. Let's navigate back. Let's go to the instance instance traffic and scaling. So in here we had selected a single instance, which is why we have the scaling group as single instance. You can also set up the instance type that this application is going to run on. In this case, it has defaultly selected a T3 micro or a T3 small. So this is the underlying EC2 instance that this is going to run this application on. Now, if you navigate back to the Beanstalk development environment, you can navigate to health and you can also see the instance that this is running on. Now, this is an EC2 instance that is created, which is where this application is running. So if I open a new tab and if I navigate to EC2 instances, you can find that instance under the instances running. So if you navigate further, you can see the same instance that's running here. So navigating into here, you can get the whole details of the underlying EC2 instance. However, you don't have to worry about these instances because this is automatically managed by AWS Beanstalk for you. Now, in this specific case, you can see that this instance type is micro as we have specified in our configuration for our Beanstalk application. Let's navigate back to Beanstalk. Now, if you want to create a new environment, you can either click Actions and use the clone environment to create a new environment. You can also create a new environment for the application right from the application. So if I navigate into Applications, you can select this and choose Create Environment, or navigate further into this and click Create New Environment. Now, this is going to create a new environment from the AWS Console. So we need a web server environment because we are running a web API. Now, this is already associated with the Hello Beanstalk application because all we are doing is adding one more environment to this application. We can specify the name. So in this case, let's specify this as prod, which is going to stand for production. Now, let's leave the domain blank, which means AWS will auto-generate one for us. Now, we'll also specify this as managed platform, and let's choose a platform, and we need to run .NET Core on Linux. So let's select that. Now, we also get the same option of the images. So it's .NET 8 and it's also having the 3.15 version. Now, if you want to run an existing version, we can specify that and select the specific version that we want to run. Now, in this case, we only have one version because we have only made one deployment. So let's select that existing version. Let's make this as high availability instead of single instance, which means multiple instances will be set up, and we'll also be set up a load balancer so that it can regulate the traffic to multiple instances. So let's select that and click Next. Now, this is where we need to specify the IAM roles that's required by Beanstalk to manage the EC2 instances. So let's specify create and use new service role. So in this case, this is going to automatically create a new role. Let's specify this as Hello Beanstalk role. We also need to specify an EC2 instance profile, which we need to manually create. So let's navigate onto a different tab. Let's go to the IAM section and let's create a new role for that. So let's create a role. Let's select create a role. Let's specify the AWS servers. Now, in this case, this needs to manage EC2. So let's select EC2 and let's leave it as the EC2 option and let's click Next. Now, we need to assign the permission policies. So we by default have Beanstalk permission policies created that we can reuse. So in this case, we want the AWS Elastic Beanstalk web tier because we are installing a web application. So let's select that and let's click Next. So this is going to assign that permission to this role. Now, in this case, let's give this a role again. So let's specify Hello Beanstalk. Now, this is a profile role. So let's specify instance profile in the name. So let's also specify instance profile role. And let's click create. Now, this is going to create the role inside our IAM, which we can start using in the Beanstalk. So let's navigate back. Let's refresh this and let's drop this down and select the new role that we just created. Now, once we have that, let's click next. Now, again, you can associate this to a VPC, but let's leave this to default VPC. Now, in this case, we can also create a database if we want, but we don't need that right now. So let's click next. Now, this is setting up the instance configurations and the root volume type. So you can choose the volume type that you require. You can also specify the CloudWatch monitoring settings and also specify the auto scaling details. Now, since we have selected load, this is coming as load balanced. The other option is the single instance. So let's specify we need a minimum of 2 instances and a maximum of 4. There are also rules that's defined here on which these instances will be increased. Let's leave that as default. So at least when our application starts, we will have 2 instances to start with. So let's keep scrolling down. In here, we can specify the instance type. So by default, this has selected T3 micro and T3 small. If you want a larger machines, you can select that from this list. Now, since this is just for demo purposes, I will leave it like this. So let's keep scrolling down and let's specify the load balancer information. Now in this case, it needs to have a health check endpoints configured so that it knows that the application is healthy. It will use that to create a new instance if the application becomes unhealthy. Now by default, it's looking at the /endpoint. However, our endpoint is at the /health. So let's edit this. So let's click the actions and say edit, and let's go to the health check section and specify the path as /health. And let's click save. Now this is the duration in which it polls to find if the application is healthy or not. Let's leave them as the defaults and click save. Now once we have this, let's specify next. Let's leave these options for health reporting as defaults. You also have the managed platform upgrades default time, which you can configure in here. You can also specify the rolling updates and how you want your application to be deployed, whether you want all at once, rolling with additional batch, immutable, and traffic splitting. So you get different options to deploy when you have multiple instances. You can click learn more to understand more about these policies. So let's keep everything with the defaults and let's click next. Now we have the final review page. You can review the options that you have selected and click submit when ready. Now this is again going to create a new environment and it is going to take some time for this to get provisioned. So this needs to set up a load balancer, deploy 2 instances, and set up the rules to forward the traffic on the load balancer as well. So let's wait for this to complete. While we are waiting on that, let's explore the application versions on this specific application. So if we navigate to application versions, you can find the version of the application. Now in this case, let's navigate to the settings and you can see there is no versioning activated, which means only the latest version will exist. You can activate a lifecycle policy and specify the details in here. So if you can limit the application limit by total count, which means only 200 versions will exist. So anytime you have the 201 version, the least used one will be removed. So when you cross this threshold, it will start overwriting some of the previous ones. So if you want, let's turn this on so that we can see different versions getting created as we make changes to our applications. So let's navigate back to Visual Studio and let's make one change. So inside here, you can see that this is randomly creating 5 different values. Let's change that to be 10. Let's publish these changes. So let's navigate to the project, say publish to AWS, and let's choose an existing configuration. So in here, we have the existing configuration to the dev environment that we had already selected. So let's click publish. Now this is going to again package this application and push this into that environment, which is the dev environment. Now since we have all the resources created earlier, this is going to be much quicker. Now we also have the other environment being created. So if I navigate into the environments, you can see that the prod environment is still getting created and it is going through the different phases. So if you navigate into that, you can see the events that's happening. So it is right now setting up the load balancer and setting up all the instances that is required. So if you navigate further into application versions and refresh this, once the Visual Studio is done, we should have a new version in there. So you can see this is currently updating in progress and it's creating a new application version. So that's the first step that it is doing. So it's packaging up the application and updating the version. So if I navigate back into the console and refresh here, you can see we have the second version. Now this is the later version, and this you can also see that this is currently deployed to dev and to prod. Now once the deployment is complete on this step, we will see a change in that. So let's wait for that. The deployment is complete to our dev environment. However, you can see here that this also deleted the application version that was previously existing. So if I navigate further into this, you can refresh this and you'll see there's only one version right now. Now, I'm not sure if this is a bug with the toolkit or this is expected to work like that. But if we navigate back into environments, you can see that our production environment is also up and running, and this is running the older version. So if I navigate into the production environment, you can find the URL for that. So let's click that to navigate to this endpoint. Now this is again going to throw an error because we don't have anything at the root of the application. So let's navigate into the weather forecast and this is going to return weather details. So you can see here, our application is now deployed to the production environment as well. If you navigate to the Health tab, you can see here we have 2 instances that is running. This is because we had specified this as a load balanced and have 2 instances. In this case, there is also a load balancer that we have been set up with, which is what is routing this URL. Now in production, we are still running the old version of our application code, which is why it was only returning 5 results. Now if I navigate back into the dev environment, and let's navigate to the URL here, and let's navigate to the API endpoint. So if I navigate to the weather forecast endpoint, you can see that this is now returning 10 records instead of 5, which is what is getting returned in our production environment. Now once we migrate this new version to prod, that will also start returning 10 records. So to deploy the new version to the production environment, let's navigate back to AWS Console. Let's go into the application versions. Let's select the version that we need to deploy, and let's say deploy that specific version. So you can choose the environment. So in this case, let's choose production and let's click deploy. Now this is going to roll out these changes based on our settings to all the instances in production. So if we navigate to the environment production right now, you can see the health events that's happening. So you can see they're starting deployment on the instance, and this is going to roll out these changes. So once that is done, we should be able to start seeing the new code inside our production environment. So you can see here, the updates are complete and the environment update completed successfully. So this rolled out the changes to both the instances, and now both of them have the new version. So if I navigate back into production and refresh this again, this also returns 10 records. So we were successfully able to create a new version and progress that across multiple environments inside our Elastic Beanstalk. Now in a real world application, I would be setting up an automated build deploy pipeline to deploy our applications into Beanstalk. If you want to learn how to do that, let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what's your preferred choice of build deploy tools like GitHub Actions, AWS Code Pipeline, etc. that you would like to see that on. Thank you, and see you soon in the next video.